Thank everybody for joining us. We've got a Gardening in the Panhandle Live is back for 2025 for our first event that I'm on. We've got a great panel for you guys today. Introduce those in just a second. Today we're going to be talking about foodscaping. So if you have any questions in addition to what we're going to talk about today, you can feel free to throw those in the chat, and we'll certainly get to those if we have time. But before we get started, I want to recognize our speakers, our panelists. To my top left, we have Joshua Chris from Santa Rosa County. Hey, Josh.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Josh just emerged from the blizzard in Iowa, so we're glad to have him back. We got Lauren Goldsby, new in Bay County.
Hey, hey.
Lauren, is this your first time on Gardening the Panhandle Live?
This is my first time. I've only watched recordings before, so I'm so happy to be here.
We are glad to have Lauren. She's a great asset to our team, and looking forward to talking with her today. And last but certainly not least on our panel, we've got Mr. Matt Lawler, also in Santa Rosa County.
Oh,
Hey, Matt. Matt's a longtime agent here in the Panhandle. A lot of knowledge. Excited to get into some stuff with him today as well. And behind the scenes, as usual, we have Julie McConnell, formerly of Bay County, now in Washington County, and Beth Bowles in the far west over there in Escambia. So if you want to, while we're going, just shout out where you're from in the chat. It always kind of makes it interesting. I saw we had one person from Walton County. But with all of that having been said, we'll go ahead and get started. Today, we're talking about foodscaping. And if you're like me, you've gardened, you've grown landscape plants, ornamentals. You may have never thought about doing some of both. So I asked the question to myself when we did this: what is foodscaping? And so I'm going to go ahead and pose that to Lauren. Lauren, what is foodscaping?
Yeah, foodscaping is a really fun way of talking about something that we've probably all done before, maybe without even realizing it. This is going to be combining edible plants with your traditional ornamental plants. Some of those that we think of are, that we've just combined them already in our garden before, but this is, an intentional combination of those.
Awesome. Yeah, kind of a unique thing. A lot of us do it already, but we don't think about it. Today, we're going to really be intentional about foodscaping and trying to add some edible stuff into our ornamental beds, and it can definitely be done. And so, Lauren, we're getting about the time of the year that folks start thinking about planting vegetables. Is it any different in a landscape bed? Do we want to go ahead and start around the same time, or is there different start dates? When should we start our foodscape edibles?
Yeah. I mean, really, the big thing that we're still going to want to focus on here is that it's going to get hot at the end of the summer. So starting your edible seeds still now is a great time to get that going. If you're planting in an ornamental bed that has really large established plants, I would maybe avoid trying to direct sow small seeds in there. It may be hard for them to really compete for light. So maybe think about putting more transplants in. But now's a great time to get those seeds started.
Awesome. Josh, we'll go over to you. Head out to Santa Rosa County for this question. Another thing? I'm super familiar with growing vegetables in a vegetable garden, but not so much in a landscape bed. Are there easier vegetables to grow in a foodscape than others? And does that differ any from a traditional, what we think of as kind of not a monoculture, but just vegetable plants in a vegetable garden?
Yeah, so the difference you're going to want to look for is things that are actually visually striking. And when it comes to things of that nature that are easy to grow, I really don't think you can beat Swiss chard. It's it has those big bright colors, and it's good in the cold, it's good in the heat. I mean, that's just a bulletproof plant. And then another one as you go into the summer that's pretty easy to grow once you get it going is amaranth. And the nice thing about amaranth is it's going to reseed itself. So once you have it, you're never going to not have it. But it's one of those noble grains, and it's really good to eat. It's really good for you. It's also very visually striking, and it's easy to grow. So it's got the combination of everything.
So you said noble grain? What is that?
Noble grain, ancient grains, one of the ones that used to be a staple on people's tables that have kind of fallen away as we've moved on to wheat and other things. But it's just a good way to get grain without all the gluten and all the wheat and all the stuff. But it's a noble grain is what it's referred to as.
All right. So there you go. Very cool. Some two interesting options that'll add some aesthetic appeal in addition to being yummy. Matt Lawler, we're going to move right down the hall from Josh in Santa Rosa County. So a lot of our gardens in the Panhandle have, large oaks, maybe some live oaks scattered through the landscape. This particular person is under an oak hammock, but has areas in the summer that may get some more sun. Are there some edibles that we can grow in these kind of landscapes that get that, 4 to 6 hours of sunlight or maybe even filtered sunlight throughout the day? What can we grow edible wise in a situation like that?
So one that I first thought of was bell peppers.
Okay.
They can handle some shade. Beth's going to post an article about growing peppers in the shade, and it's talking about soilless culture or a hydroponic way to grow bell peppers.
Mm-hmm.
But the gist of the article also talks about growing in the shade, and they can handle some shade. You can grow them in containers or in the ground, just depending on how many oak roots are in the way. Um, you can grow lettuce, a lot of different lettuce, and I'm talking leaf lettuces, not head
Okay.
lettuce, in the
Right.
shade. Um, Probably not throughout the summer, but at least something to think about maybe for the fall.
Okay. Um, Kind of like growing in a high tunnel, would growing under a little bit of shade like that help to extend seasons a little bit, maybe, or no?
It definitely would with the bell peppers, and that's what that study, that article also talks about, is how they're able to continue to grow bell peppers later into the summer when they started a spring crop.
Okay. Interesting. So that's a couple of good options there for those of y'all that have a little bit of a shady situation at your house. Josh, we've talked about edible vegetables so far, but what if we want to grow some herbs in our foodscape here? What herbs, in your opinion, may work best, kind of interplanting in a landscape that has, shrubs, annuals, perennials, just kind of a normal landscape?
Any of the herbs will work, but if you're looking for something that's going to help out your other plants, you're looking for those plants that have a lot of essential oil in them and a lot of things of that nature. And so you're wanting that scent and that smell, and that oil is going to deter a lot of your insects. And so some good ones for that are like thyme and rosemary, and those big real the ones that we associate with the smells of herbs. Are going to be great for that. Now, I would avoid planting mint in the ground. I know that could deter a lot of insects, but mint's going to spread like crazy. So you probably want to avoid that one. I would stick more with the thyme and the rosemary types.
Yeah, I've done the mint thing in the ground before. It can get a little out of control. Keep the mints in the pots, and you
Yes.
will, and your other plants will probably be happier too. Um, Matt, so we pretty much stuck just kind of near the ground, but let's move up in the air a little bit. Talk about some trees for foodscaping. Let's first talk about, I've kind of got these out of order in our spreadsheet. The first one I'll talk about is what fruit trees can you grow in a foodscape? What plays well with other landscaping plants, and what would, in your opinion, would work nicely?
Um, so I would the main thing with fruit trees is to look at the varieties. I mean, we can grow just about anything. I would avoid apples. They don't do too well in this part of the country.
Okay.
But peaches, pears, plums are different citrus, and we'll talk about citrus a little bit later. But we have some cold hardy citrus that we can grow,
Hmm.
and that could help, you know, be part of the foodscape. The thing that I would look at is when we're picking out varieties, at least for like peaches and plums, is to look at some of the Auburn and University of Georgia varieties, or varieties that they've released, or varieties that they grow in those states. Just those what might be a little bit more relevant to us. Most of the Florida varieties are trying to get those fruit down farther south into the state. And what happens there is we'll get something that blooms too early in the spring,
Mhm.
and all the flowers will fall off when we get a cold event. So,
Okay, so that is interesting. So you're saying some of the low chill varieties actually are too low chill for our area, maybe.
oh, definitely. Yes.
Okay. Interesting. That's something we don't always think about. We just go for, we hear we need low chill, and you can go too low. All right, that's good. Speaking of citrus, Matt, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about that. If we want to add a couple of citrus trees or maybe just one or two into our landscape, um, what of those would pair nicely in sort of a normal sized landscape at someone's home, and maybe speak a little bit about growing needs and how long from planting a young tree in a 3 or 5 gallon container, how long does it take to actually to get fruit that you can harvest and eat?
Sure. So I don't think you can go without having a Satsuma mandarin tree. That's going to be our most cold hardy citrus in this area. And I would pick one of the varieties that we know does well, like Owari, Owari, or Brown Select. Two good options for the Panhandle. You could go with some tangerines. You could go, if you went lemon, I would probably go with the Meyer lemon. It's a hybrid between a navel and a lemon. And it's going to be a lot hardier. It's not going to be as sour of a flavor as a lemon, but it makes some really good juice. Um, as far as, how long that plant is going to take, uh, it's going to start making fruit, after it's at a pot a year or so. It'll put on flowers, but I would recommend maybe knocking off those flowers or those little fruit as they form, and trying to beef up that plant, get a little bit stronger trunk to it and little more leaf material. So maybe 3 to 5 years, and then you can start harvesting some fruit off of it. Um, and then just follow, as far as fertilization, look for a good citrus fertilizer or fruit tree fertilizer that has some of those micronutrients in it, like zinc is a big one. Um, Zinc and iron for citrus.
Okay. And while you're talking about nutrients right there, in your opinion, in our foodscapes, should you do a soil test before you plant some of these vegetables or fruit trees that we've talked about? A lot of folks are kind of familiar with the nutritional needs of their landscape plants, but will that change with our vegetables and fruit? And should you get a soil test for that?
Sure. I mean, we are going to have some variability in what our different plant material is going to want. So we're going to have to try
Okay.
to find some sort of balance there, in this foodscape, um, just to kind of make everything as happy as it can be. But I mean, if you're going to plant something pretty intensive, it's going to be hard to take some soil samples later on, as everything kind of grows together. So when you're first getting started, I would definitely do some soil sampling.
Okay, awesome. Josh, let's talk a little bit about companion planting. I've done a little bit of this, but I could definitely learn some more. I'm gonna ask you about that. So, what about companion planting? Maybe just a little bit of what is that for the audience, and then the big question with companion planting is how do you decide what plant to put where in the garden?
Sure. So companion planting, you're essentially looking for some sort of ecological service from one plant that benefits another one. Now, whether or not that's pest management or whether or not that's some sort of pollinator service, or whether or not they have what we call a liliopathy, which is just some root exudates that may deter certain diseases in another plant, that does exist. Now, I don't have them all categorized in my head, but those things do exist. And so it's worth looking into what those do. Actually, an easy one for the root exudates would be planting a legume in with your gardens, since they pull that nitrogen out of the air and then they produce a little bit too much and they put some of that into your soil. So that would be a good way to get a little bit of nitrogen into your soil. But as far as deciding what to put where, you really need to look at, if you have a plant that's very susceptible to insects, maybe you put your thyme and your rosemaries, like we talked about earlier, over by that plant, because that might deter some of those pests, or at least give you a little bit of some kind of a buffer for them. Or you may use what we call a trap crop, which is where you put something that's very susceptible to insects over by the plants that you want to keep healthy. The insects will attack that trap crop, and you can wait until it's getting hurt a little bit, and then you can go ahead and remove it. And by doing so, you remove all those insects out of your garden along with it. That's kind of what we're looking for with companion planting.
Okay. So the little bit of companion planting I've done has been like, marigolds and stuff like that in my vegetable garden. That's companion planting as well?
That is, because the marigolds, they produce a scent that the insects don't like.
Oh,
The
okay.
bad insects don't like,
Gotcha. Very
the
good.
herbivores.
Okay. So in addition to being pretty, it's given us some other services. I like it. Lauren, um, let's say we don't have enough room or we need something that's gonna climb a little bit. What vegetables can we grow if we want to put a little trellis in our landscape, in our foodscape?
Yeah, trellis is a great way to take advantage of space that we don't always get to use in a garden. Things like cucumbers, squash, passion flower, a lot of beans, a lot of pole beans, and some pea varieties. Even I would consider things that you'd normally like put a tomato cage around. Some tomatoes can be almost in a pseudo trellis in between two lines if you kind of plant them right. And a trellis can also be thought of as a way to really provide some shade for some things under the ground too. So you're taking advantage of space up here that you don't normally get to use, and you might get a little bit more soil space to play with.
That's true, and having something growing up like that can give you a nice little architectural aesthetic in your landscape. So
Oh,
it's a
it's gorgeous.
win-win. Josh, this person says they need to add soil to their native food garden. maybe some considerations for some soil amendments and how to improve just generally the soil in your landscape so that you can better grow some of these food crops.
Sure. So this is the question I get quite a bit, is people always wonder what's the best bagged soil I can possibly go out there and get? And the answer, as it always is it depends. You really do need to know what the texture of your soil is. Most of our soil here is going to be a lot more on the sandy side. Now, sandy soils aren't great for holding on to nutrition, and they're not great for holding on to water. And so they do need to be amended occasionally. Most often people would use compost, but I hear a lot of people that just throw nothing but compost in there, which is also bad, because now you're going to overdrive a lot of that nutrition that is inherent in that compost, and it's going to release a lot more nitrogen year after year than maybe those plants can handle. So a little bit of compost is good, say about 1/2 inch or so, mixed in with some topsoil to give it a little bit of bulk, will really help that area out. Now, when it does come to adding things like that, compost comes with a fertilizer component to it. And unless you know what that is, you could very easily overdrive that. And that's where we go back to the soil test that you and Matt were talking about a little bit ago. You need to make sure that all this stuff is tested so that you're not putting too much fertilizer down on these vegetable crops and on these ornamental crops, and you're making them underproduce because you're just overdriving that nutrition.
Okay, awesome. Real good answer. Matt, this is an interesting question. This is kind of similar to what we talked about earlier, but maybe even a little bit more specialized with shade. What vegetables would grow among pine trees and cherry laurel trees? You know, is there something that you can grow maybe in an environment where there's going to be some significant root competition or shade, something like that?
Yeah, I saw this one, and my first thought was shade with the peppers and the lettuce, and then my second thought was having a lower pH, maybe with the pine trees. So you're going to have to strategically plant them, but one plant or one crop that can handle a lower pH than other vegetable crops are sweet potatoes. So my thought here would be, if you do have some soil that you can kind of bank up some beds or, some hills to plant those sweet potatoes in to allow them space for their roots to grow. That might be an option underneath these trees. Another option is people have some pretty good success growing sweet potatoes and other types of potatoes in pine straw alone. So if you were able to just make some straight pine straw beds, the only thing is you got to find a way to get some light filtered through. I would think, with the pine trees, usually they do allow some pretty good light to come through, and you might be okay getting some light to those sweet potato vines. They're not really going to climb like other vining crops, but you might have a way that you could also get them to climb some of those trees as well.
Interesting. I like that, kind of thinking outside the box with sweet potatoes there. Josh,
Sure.
maybe we don't even have space in our yard to put a tree in our landscape, like a fruit tree. What if we want to put a fruit tree in a container, something like a fig or a kumquat, something like that? Can we grow those fruit trees, especially the smaller ones, in containers? And if we do, how should we care for those as far as fertility?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So you certainly can. Most of the fruit trees do come in a containerized ability. You can do that. You probably do want to make sure that you're getting the dwarf fruit trees, because you got to think about the root space that they need. And you're going to need to consistently upgrade that pot or that container, whatever you have it in, to accommodate that root space. But you do need to go back, and you're going to have to be very intentional with your irrigation and very intentional with your fertilization if you have something in a container. It's going to get lost quite a bit quicker than it would just in the ground. And so you need to make sure that you're just really on top of particularly irrigation, and making sure that that plant has enough water, but not too much water to where you're drowning it, because we can't forget that our plants need air in their roots as well. So you got to be very, very intentional with your fertilizers and with your irrigation in that situation.
All right, very good. Yeah, I think the thing that folks forget about that is if you're successfully growing those fruit trees, they're going to, like you said, progressively outgrow their containers. So you do get to a point where it gets hard to repot and move those, and at some point you'll have to make that decision. Is it too much to repot it? Do I need to just start over with a smaller one, or maybe even put it in the ground? I've had to get to that point before, but yeah, good answer. Matt, we don't often think about vegetables and food plants as being particularly drought resistant. But if you do have a landscape and you're trying to watch your water, that sort of thing, What are some of the better drought resistant food plants that we can grow?
So I saw this question and I thought, well, I can't think of really a whole lot that is drought resistant that
No.
would survive in our environment. Um, some of the different tropical crops like yucca, um, and some of those root crops, they can handle some significant drought. But things that we can grow, I think we need to look at it more of a standpoint of how can we conserve water. So we want to make sure we can use some different mulch materials, whether it be like a landscape fabric, which we might not do too much in a like a food forest type situation, but we could use some natural mulches um, with like some different pine straw or pine bark. We might probably need to be careful with some of our like poultry mulches with the potential to rob some of the nutrients from our other crops just because of the charge that they have when they're on the ground and they're coming in contact with different fertilizer. The other thing, and I didn't send a link, but I just put it in the
Sure.
contact there. I think I need to switch it to everyone, so I'll work on that. But
Okay.
there's a group called Echo, and they're not affiliated with the University of Florida, so I'm just telling you, check it out on your own time. But they do a lot of work internationally,
Mhm.
training missionaries and other people that go out to every country you could ever think of, and they've done some different studies on some different crops that can handle those situations, and you might find some stuff there. It might not be something that's going to be what we would call like a perennial crop. It might die down in the frost every year and we have to replant it, but it might also be something that can handle some of those drought conditions or low moisture situations.
Okay. Awesome. That's cool. I'll check that out as well. I've not heard of those guys. Lauren, and what you folks out there may not know is Lauren did some of her university work with blueberries when she was in school. So we have somewhat of a blueberry specialist on the talk with us today. So this is the perfect question for you, Lauren.
Good question.
This listener has 3 to 4 blueberry bushes. They're 2 to 4 years old. It's still pretty young, and they have not yet made blueberries. So what does this listener need to do to ensure that blueberries eventually get made? And do they also just need to be a little patient? What say you, the blueberry girl?
I would have expected them to make fruit at this point, but I also say that blueberries are really finicky and tricky little plants sometimes. So if they're not in the right conditions, they can absolutely not be producing. I would start with asking a few questions. The first one is, would they be the same variety of blueberry? Because blueberries do need a cross pollinator in order to produce fruit. They'll produce flowers, but those flowers will fall off. Some varieties will be sold as a self-pollinating variety, and you'll get some fruit, but with cross-pollination, you get much larger fruit. So it is recommended to have 2 different kinds. If any pruning has occurred, you could have cut off some potential flowers. Blueberries do set their reproductive structures in the fall. So sometimes people want to winter prune and cut them shorter, but we do risk cutting off those flowers, almost like pruning an azalea before it flowers. If it's not pruned at the right time, you reduce your flowers for the next year. And then finally, bringing it back to the soil test. Blueberries do prefer a very acidic pH. So they're going to be happiest between 4.5 and 5.5 on the pH scale. And so if you're not in an area that's already naturally acidic, or you haven't been adding an acidifying fertilizer or sulfur to decrease the pH, it's really likely that your blueberries are just in a situation that has too high of a pH, and they won't be able to pull up nutrients. They won't really be growing much. So they'll also be deficient in that. Kind of that can apply to a lot of different situations with blueberries. Definitely reach out to your local office and I would start with a soil test if you haven't done one, but that should kind of help if they're not producing.
Yeah, that's an awesome answer. I really like what you said. If you're having issues with this kind of stuff and we don't answer your question thoroughly, call your local extension agent. Or if you're in Bay County, reach out to Lauren. I'm sure she would be happy to help you with your blueberry plant. So
Happy to. Happy to.
perfect world, that listener is in Bay County and you'll be able to help them out there. So Josh, we talked about herbs with you just a few minutes ago. We got another herb question here. This listener tries to plant lavender in the garden, but it has never really done well. Lots of us have had that experience. Mediterranean plants tend to struggle here. What nutrients in our soil should this person add? Or maybe is there a different variety of lavender you need to try? Basically, just tell us, how can we be successful with lavender in the Panhandle?
Oh, sure. Lavender is a tricky one, especially up here. So the thing that most people don't realize, like you said, they're a Mediterranean plant generally. There is an English version, but they're a Mediterranean plant, and which makes them much more of a deserty type plant. And so in an area like ours, where we're getting 73 inches of rain per year, it's going to be kind of tricky to take care of them. So there's a couple of things you're really going to want to look at. One, don't put anything in the hole when you plant them. These are plants that are desert environment plants. They are used to not having anything to really survive on. And so if you give them a bunch of stuff to survive on, it's one of those things of where you're spoiling them. And once you spoil them, they're no good. You may also think about putting them up on a little bit of a hill. They're not going to want a lot of water. And so you're going to need to give it that water someplace to drain. So if you put them on top of a little mound, that gives that water somewhere to go. So it's not just sitting right on the plant root. And finally, in the summer here, since we're so humid, you're going to have, again, problems. So you're going to want to make sure you're pruning them open so you get some wind through there and prevent a lot of those fungal issues. There is a version of lavender that in theory works really well here. But if you're not doing any of those other things, then it doesn't really matter if it in theory works very well here. But that's phenomenal lavender. Will do very well here. But again, you need to give it the right environment to live in to do and thrive.
Okay. Yeah, lavender's tough. It just is. But Josh gave you some good pointers. If you try those things, you'll probably be at least a little bit successful with lavender. We do have a couple of lavender farms in the area, so it's possible. So follow Josh's advice. Very good. Josh, while we're here with you, let's go ahead and talk about apples a little bit. And Matt did tell us earlier that apples are hard in the Panhandle. They definitely are. You're getting two of the hardest plants to grow, and back to back, you got lavender and apples. So like you did with lavender, tell us what we can do to make an apple or two here and there.
Well, the thing with apples is it's not that they're hard to grow here, it's that they're hard to get to produce here. And so the big key to that, kind of like Matt already said, you want to make sure that you're getting the chill hours that apple needs per year, but you don't want to get them so early that you wind up freezing all the flowers off. And so you got to really be specific with your varieties. There is a variety that was founded in Bruton, Alabama. It's called the shell apples. They're not really commercially overly available, but they are out there and you can find them. But a shell apple will do a little bit better here, probably towards the north end of the Panhandle versus the south end of the Panhandle, just because we get a little bit colder up in the north end. But the thing you really, really, really need to pay attention to is how many chill hours those plants need, because if they're not getting the chill hours they need, you're never going to get apples.
That's right. And I think a lot of the apple varieties, like the traditional apple varieties, need like 700,000-800,000 chill hours. And we, this year, normal years, what are we getting? Like 500, 400, something like that.
Yeah. A lot of them are up in the thousands, and we're only getting about 800, even in the north end of the county.
Depends on where you are.
So,
for sure. Yeah. Good deal. Matt, obviously we just talked about the north end of a lot of our counties or some of our inland counties, but for those of us that are a little bit closer to the water, be that the bays or the Gulf of Mexico, gardening does change a little bit. And so what edibles can we grow if we do have that occasional salt spray or salt intrusion, from wind or water?
Okay. So we've got a publication that goes over the thresholds of different crops to salt water or salinity. Cowpeas, black-eyed peas.
Really?
Any of your peas like that are going to be more salt tolerant than anything else. Then we go down to some different cucurbit crops can handle some salt. And then the list also includes tomatoes. I'll be a little weary with tomatoes because I don't think they would like too much, but definitely growing some peas. And that's all I got on that.
So I will say, what if you live maybe even on a canal or on the bay or something like that, and you do get high tides and storms and stuff, could you just grow your vegetables in a container? Would the salt spray bother those, or are we mostly talking about actual saltwater intrusion that would be harmful?
So that list is talking more about saltwater intrusion.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, that would be another solution would be to have
Okay.
some raised beds or some containers, and then maybe a way to just kind of shield. If you are get some pretty heavy winds, if you're right on the coast,
Okay.
shield those crops from those winds.
Yeah, cool. Good solutions there if you live near the salt. Lauren gave you a little bit of a break there, but we're back. This is an interesting question. How to protect plants from bugs without pesticides? Obviously, a lot of us think we've got bugs. The first thing we want to do is get out there and spray something on them and kill them. But maybe what are some things we can do before we have to pull those pesticides out to keep bugs off our plants?
Yeah, of course. It's never fun to go out to your plants and see them covered in bugs. So we can do a few things to hopefully stop it before it gets that bad, before it gets something that we really need a curative option. A lot of the things we've been describing today on this call fall into integrative pest management and things that we already want to be doing, like growing our plants at the right time, growing them with the right conditions, really reducing stress as much as we can to avoid creating a space that pests can come in. And then foodscaping in general really allows for a much more ecologically diverse group of plants that you have. So this is going to attract other bugs to come in, other insects, some of which might predate and eat some of the bad insects that we have in our bugs, or that we have in our yards. Something that we can do to kind of keep an eye on it is walk your plants, get to know them, get familiar with taking your coffee out there and kind of seeing what's going on. If you see those bugs, a lot of times you can physically wipe them off or remove them. If you see aphids come along, you might be able to get them when they're still young, but letting those populations build up a little bit and seeing what beneficial predators might come in and take care of them naturally. And then in the chat, there's also a really great publication that goes into a lot of different natural remedies for these. A lot of these are still pesticides, but they're derived from some of them derived from bacteria, some of them derived from other plants, and things we can use that are a little bit of a safer option for us, as well as the other beneficial insects that are around in our garden spaces and butterflies and everything we want to keep in our backyards.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that. Scouting, I am a morning coffee waterer in my raised beds. I go hand water my beds in the morning with a cup of coffee in one hand. Normally, unless it's really hot outside, then we may switch to an ice water or something. But a couple years ago, good little anecdote. I was out wandering and watering my plants with drinking my coffee, right? And I spotted a tomato leaf that looked weird on the top. And I just was like, that's strange. I'm out in my plants every day, so I kind of know what they look like and I know what they should look like. And I turned the leaf over, and there are hundreds of teeny tiny armyworms under there. And so I was able to pick that leaf off, crush those armyworms, toss them in the garbage, good to go, never had to spray. So that's my favorite tip of the day, Lauren. I love that. Good job.
We hear a
So,
lot, it happened overnight. And maybe some things do happen overnight,
yeah,
but a lot of times you see things like that and you can realize, oh, those little army worms, it would have felt like overnight if you didn't
yeah,
see them when they're
exactly.
tiny.
They can do a lot of damage in a hurry when they grow up, but when they're
Yeah.
little, you can still get them. Matt, we've talked a little bit about bugs. Let's move on to some bigger critters. What about pest control in the garden, keeping more like vertebrates and wild nuisance wildlife and that kind of stuff out of the yard? How do we handle that?
Sure. So I mean, there's a few approaches that we could take. We could either do some physical barriers, so we could do some different types of fencing, or like a hardware cloth around trees to keep deer and other things from going and rubbing on those trees, or just having like a wildlife fence. There's some temporary fencing that's more of just a softer material that you could lay over plants and other crops. You could do like some scare tactics. So there's some different motion activated sprinklers that you can purchase. There's for birds, there's just like balloons that have like a scarecrow face that's kind of scary for them. There's some different ribbon and foil materials that create a sound and also reflect light to try to scare things away. And then the last are some like chemical repellents, and a lot of times those will have either like capsaicin, so like a hot pepper extract in them, or they'll have some egg solids. So it'll either be, either the scent that scares things away, or a taste, or a mixture of the both or both. For squirrels, I'm thinking, sometimes they like to go and they'll eat like pecans, or they'll go in and get into fruit trees.
Yeah.
So you can get some like metal sheeting and make like a little tent that goes on the trunk of the tree, or wrap the tree with that metal to make it harder to climb up. But squirrels are smart and they can jump from a lot of different areas. Um, the other thing, we do have sometimes, if we have a yard that has some palm trees or some other trees that have, kind of like a dead mass of
Hmm.
material, we might have an issue with roof rats. So that would be another rodent that could get up into our trees. You could try the same thing as squirrels, or you could physically attach a trap, like a mouse trap, to the tree so that they try to climb up it, and they get caught that way. Um,
Yeah.
the
Squirrels
only
are
thing
tough.
with the only thing with killing rodents or wildlife in the garden, the thought there is food safety. So we just need to be careful. If we do have that, we need to not harvest anything in that general vicinity.
Yeah. Man, wildlife's tough. The deer want to eat everything, the squirrels want to eat everything. So you kind of have to coexist around them and use some of Matt's exclusion methods and some other things there. So thank you, Matt. It's a real problem. We talked about some vegetables today. And Matt, let's talk about some vegetables that maybe you can grow in a small space, be that a container or maybe a limited little ground area. What are some plants that may play well in those small areas and not a large traditional vegetable garden?
So I mean, we could grow just about anything in a container. We just need to think about, maybe more the depth of the container. Our tomatoes and, um, you know, more upright growing plants are going to need at least 12 inches or so to get their root system fully developed. Uh, uh, Lettuces are going to be pretty in containers. You could also think about it as an ornamental type container, and kind of do lettuces on the outside, and something taller growing up, some different herbs and things. Um, any herbs are going to grow well in containers. Uh, if it is something like a tomato, or maybe an eggplant, some of our different, fruiting varieties of plants, we may want to look into varieties that have smaller fruit or smaller growth habits. So a lot of our cherry tomatoes might have a little smaller growing growth habit, um, if we pick determinate varieties. With tomatoes, they could either be vining, or
No
they
doubt.
have a bush habit. So for a container, if we don't have a way to trellis it, we're going to need to go with a determinate variety.
Awesome. Yeah, so lots of options there. I like that. Lauren, staying on containers. In your opinion, is it easier to grow plants and vegetables in containers versus in the ground? If you had to do one or the other, what do you think?
Oh, that's a hard question, one or the other.
Both,
I
right?
I think it's really approachable. I think it's a method that, it might differ based on the person. If you've got
Okay.
incredibly good, nice, fertile soil outside that you're perfectly fine getting down and working and growing in, and you enjoy that, put your plants in the ground. You can grow a lot of them, you can have more space, you can irrigate them easier, and they are more protected in the soil. But for people who may not live in a space that has a yard, for people who may, I'm looking at my yard right now, I
Yeah.
don't want to put vegetables out there until I amend the soil and spend some time. And I said
Hmm.
I would do that in the fall, and I didn't. So now I'm here in the spring. Some of my plants are going to go in a container. I think it's a great way to start. Some things to consider, just like Matt touched on, they are in a container. It's having a dwarf variety or something that's a little smaller does make it easier. But it's a fun experiment to kind of see
Yeah.
what you can do. Some of my favorite gardens I've had have come out of necessity in the space that you have. And I just find I don't know, you get lucky when you have a small space and you can put time into it, but pay attention to watering. That's going to be a big thing when it gets hot in containers. If you can set up some sort of automatic timer or drip system that takes away some of that human error, nothing hurts more than coming home and realizing you forgot to water some large
Yeah.
or tomatoes. And that can just happen pretty quickly in a container. The soil is forgiving.
I like that. That is so true. We've all gone on a long weekend or something and come back to tomato plants that look very, very sad, and that's not good for the plants or the fruit. So Lauren, while we've got you here and we're talking about tomatoes already, what are some of your favorite tomatoes for our area? What are some of the easier ones to grow? Some of the more rewarding varieties?
Yeah, yeah. There is a variety list that will go out in the chat, and that's kind of an older list, but what I do like that it separates is it's got information on the disease resistance to wilts, and it does have some information on north or south, but to me, Florida is going to be hot pretty soon. So what they're growing in South Florida, we should be able to grow for most of the summer up in North Florida as well. The determinant tomatoes that have that bushing growth habit are going to typically do better up here, and smaller tomatoes are just going to perform better with ripening faster, and there's less time that a small tomato has to ripen where a bug can get in. Sometimes you're waiting on one of those large heirloom tomatoes to ripen only to find out that a worm got in it a few days ago. I say try different varieties, see what you grow best with in your space container in the ground. But a good safe bet are smaller tomato varieties. The evergreen tomato or the Everglade tomatoes do really, really well. Those are like candy. And Sun Gold is my personal favorite.
I was just about to ask you, what is your favorite tomato? So good job reading my
Sun
mind and
Gold. It's like
answering.
candy.
Sun Gold. So you're a little sweet tomato girl. I like it. So my favorite tomato that I grow is Early Girl. It's just really easy. It's in and out before it gets hot and the bugs and all get here. I've had a ton of success with Early Girl, planting it early and harvesting middle of May and you're done. Matt, Josh, do y'all have a favorite tomato you grow?
Everglades.
Everglades.
Yeah, you can't
I've
stop
actually
those
never
things.
done that. Y'all are
They'll start
convincing.
popping up everywhere. You can't
Oh, no,
stop
they're
those things
great.
from growing.
Okay, I'll have to try that. Matt, do you have a tomato that you go back to year after year?
I'm gonna have to go with the hard one to grow, but I'll go with Cherokee Purple because it's a good one.
It is hard to grow. You don't make as many, but there's just nothing like a Cherokee Purple slice for sure. That's a good one. Lauren, last question for you, and then we'll mix it up a little bit here towards the end. This was an interesting question because normally think about edible plants. Everybody likes full sun, with our vegetables and our food crops typically, but I'll see how you approach it. This question was, are there edibles that can handle our full direct sun? Because it does get harsh.
Yeah, it absolutely does get harsh here. And it's a great thing to think of before putting something in the ground. I think it's awesome forethought there. Most of, when I think about a plant that's producing a fruit or really anything that is producing in a large quantity, it's very energy intensive. So a lot of times these plants are going to rely on being in a full sun environment just to be able to produce enough energy to make the fruit that we pick off of it, especially something like a tomato, an intensive fruit. So I kind of think of, there's not much that I think of that can't handle the full direct sun, but it's important to make sure that there's water availability. This past summer and fall, we had very little rainfall. And there might be trees or crops that you have on your property that typically in the summer don't need as much irrigation. But if we go a few weeks without water, it would be a good idea to supplement a little bit during our hottest times of the year.
Yeah, I mean, we think of Florida as being a really rainy place, but last year, in a lot of the Panhandle, we were significantly under our average annual rainfall, so that can definitely impact stuff. That's good. Good answer, Lauren. Josh, this client has 3 fruit trees on their property when they moved here 2 years ago, but have not produced any fruit. Obviously, it would be good to know what these trees are. But should this person remove a tree that's not fruiting? What do you think about that?
Well, I think you already hit on the main part is we don't know what they are, and therefore we don't know if they have a pollinator or need a pollinator, and that might be why they're not fruiting. Are they even flowering would be another question that I would want to get into. When you go out there, do you see the flowers? Do you have bees all over them? Is there some kind of way that they're trying to get pollinated that it's not actually happening? That would be my first question. My second question would be, how were they planted? Are they planted too deep? Is there airspace in the roots? Are they established? Did they never get established properly? Those are all things that you really do need to know the answers to. The planting it too deep is the one that we see the most often around here. At least that's the one I see the most often around here.
All the time.
Yeah, that top root really does need to be about an inch or more, even a little bit more is okay, above the soil. And the reason for that is that tree is going to settle over time. And as it does, you want that root system up. As I mentioned earlier, you need air in the root system. And if you don't have air in the root system, it can't get the carbon and the hydrogen and the oxygen that it needs, which are the biggest components of biomass. And so if you're not getting that, you're not going to get a tree that grows. But the biggest one for this question would be, if you don't know what they are and you don't know how to find out what they are or what cultivar they are, you might just not have a pollinator form. And that's probably the biggest reason they're not fruiting. You can cut a little section off, a little piece of a branch off, or you can take some pictures and bring it into your extension office, and your master gardeners and your hort agent will do the best they can to get it identified for you. And then you might want to just plant a companion for it that's going to help it produce. And then if it still doesn't produce, yeah, maybe time to take them out.
All right, good job. Yeah, I mean, once you've exhausted all of those things that Josh says, if you're still struggling with a plant, don't hesitate to pull it out and do something different. I tell people all the time, life's too short to grow full of plants that don't want to grow and fruit. We can do other things. So don't get too emotionally attached to your plants. I'll tell you that. Josh, while we're on fruit, we had someone in the chat pose a question about avocados. Trying to grow avocados in the Panhandle. Would you mind touching on that for a minute? Are there some varieties or types of avocados?
I even went and found you a document I'll throw on here real quick.
Man, you're good.
Yeah, so avocados are another tricky plant. And I know that they make cold hardy varieties, but man, they're just barely more cold hardy than the normal avocado tree. So you really have to pay very close attention to the variety that you get. You have to pay very close attention to how you plant it, and you are going to need to protect that plant in the winter. One thing you might try is, if you have other trees planted around it, you may create yourself a little microclimate, which is just essentially you lose heat in your garden because it radiates out. But if you have trees planted around it, they have a tendency to trap some of that heat and keep it a little bit warmer. That might be an area that an avocado would do a little bit better, but you're really going to have to pay attention to not overwatering them. They're very susceptible to root rot. You're going to have to make sure that there's a lot of things that go into an avocado here. And it's really, we get cold. And as soon as we get cold, you're going to run into having to baby that plant for years until it's big enough to actually produce and to actually grow very well. So you just have to be real intentional about avocados here.
Yeah, I've got a person in Calhoun County that actually grows a couple of avocado trees, but they grow them inside a high tunnel. They're planted in the ground, but they're inside a high tunnel. So that's a lot of time and expense and effort to grow some avocados. But if you do find yourself in a situation like that, might be an option. So good job. Thanks, Josh. One more for you, Josh, before we get out of here with you. Is there any chance, let's say we're applying glyphosate, Roundup, do this all the time to clean up an in-ground vegetable garden before we go back in, or in the landscape as well, spraying weeds. Is there any chance of chemical residues from glyphosate applied in the early fall to carry over to vegetable crops planted? What say you about that?
Yeah, sure. So glyphosate is one of those, it's almost mythical at this point, the information that runs around about glyphosate. What you need to understand about your chemical controls is that they are very controlled by the EPA, and they're very controlled by the FDA to make sure that if applied at label rate, they're not going to harm you. And if they are applied at their label rate, even glyphosate is pretty inert towards you, assuming you're wearing the PPE, the protective equipment you're supposed to wear, and you're applying it at the rate that it says to apply it. Then it's pretty safe. That said, it should not affect, you should not get residues, because the way that glyphosate works is it affects stem and leaf tissue, and it actually has no efficacy in the soil. Once it gets into the soil, it just kind of washes through. It doesn't do anything to the roots, and the plants can't uptake it at that point. So you should be fine. It only gets taken up to the plant by the leaf and by the root. But that all said, make sure that you're really on top of your IPM. Just get to the point where you don't need to use chemical controls as best as you can. And if you can do that, if you do need to find yourself needing to use chemical controls, apply it where it's needed. You don't need to do a blanket application of glyphosate everywhere to get rid of 3 weeds. If you need to, get yourself a little bit of the solution and a paintbrush and paint it on the leaf of that plant. and that will get rid of just that plant instead of really affecting the whole area.
So you mentioned trying to get to a point where we don't have to apply a lot of herbicides. What would be some methods you might think about to try to help get to that point?
So we'd already talked about planting trees correctly. You need to plant them a little bit higher. That's going to make them healthier, make them more stress-free. Lauren talked about putting blueberry bushes in an area that's naturally a little bit more acidic. That's going to keep you from having to constantly amend that soil, which one, takes the work off of you, and two, keeps that plant a little bit healthier and a little bit more stress-free. Make sure that you're watering appropriately, make sure that you're fertilizing appropriately. Don't just go out there and throw fertilizer everywhere because somebody said that they like to use 20 pounds in a 10 square foot area. You really do need to look into how much fertilizer these plants need. If you over fertilize them, they will get stressed, and stressed plants attract insects.
Okay. How about weeds?
How about weeds?
Yeah, reducing weeds without using chemicals.
Sure. So the biggest thing that you're going to do, the biggest thing you can do in a standard garden situation, that first 4 to 6 weeks, once you get your plants put out there, you're going to have to just intensively control. And if you don't want to use chemicals, that means mechanical controls. You're going to have to go out there and pick these weeds. But you do that for that first 4 to 6 weeks, and then you give the vegetable plants that are in there that ecological advantage. And at that point, they're going to be up and they're going to be big enough that they're going to start to control the weeds on their own. So they're going to shade them out and they're going to suck up the resources faster than the weeds can. And that will control a lot of your weeds just naturally.
Okay, very good. Lauren, second to last question of the day. What about native plants for foodscaping? Are there any native options we could include in our landscapes that we could munch on from time to time?
Absolutely, there are.
I had a feeling you might say that.
Some that come to mind, blueberry, of course, that's the first one I was going to say. Blueberries, blackberries, Chickasaw plum, maypop, muscadine grapes, pecans and persimmons. Those are all human edible native plants that we would, love to have in our environments. You can, for a lot of those, still buy a native cultivar or a wild cultivar, maybe of them if you find a native nursery that carries that in your area. But there's also going to be some commercially available hybridized varieties that are still, at its core, that native species, but have been developed to produce maybe a larger fruit, maybe grow a little bit more aggressively and handle planting better. And then, consider that in your foodscape, there might be other things that you want to attract to eat things that aren't just people. We have, birds in the area. We'll have a different pollinators that we want to attract. So things like a beautyberry or a sparkleberry or some of those native vacciniums that are evergreen, the darrowii, that are really nice. Attracting other things to eat and pollinate and be around your space will just make it an inviting space for other creatures and yourself, if that's a goal.
I love it. Before we get to our last question, which I'm excited to hear Matt answer, Josh, I see you're typing in the answer, but I'll just go ahead and ask it to the group. This is a cool question. Recently, I attempted to burn the weeds of last year's garden. Dude, I love these little flamethrower weeders. They're great. Nick Simmons over in Escambia County, the county director, his wife has one. He sent me a picture of her, and she was just out there killing weeds with that flamethrower. But this person used that, and they learned that their soil is flammable. Came back hours later and found that half of their soil had turned to ash or disappeared. So I'm guessing pretty heavily amended soil. Learned a lesson, but would that ash ruin the dirt, or can I add more dirt and compost on top? So what say you about that?
Is that for anybody, or do you want
That's
me,
for
since
you.
I was typing it?
That's for you, Josh. Yeah. So what about the ash residue
yeah,
results from the flamethrower weeding?
Yeah, my guess would be that there's a lot of compost in that area, and some of it probably had not composted, and that's probably the stuff that burned. You do have to be careful. Ash is our weakest form of a lime, but it is a form of a lime. And so my suspicion is that you have changed the pH of that soil. And it may just be a little bit. You may not have overcome that buffering capacity, which, if you don't know, there's a buffering capacity that's inherent in soil that keeps that soil at a certain pH. For the most part, you can override it. And that's why when we send off our tests, they'll come back and that line will be on there. It'll say buffering capacity, and therefore we recommend this much lime. There's a certain amount of lime you have to put down before any amount of lime you put down changes the soil pH. But there may have been enough ash in that to have changed the soil pH. So I would get it tested and make sure that you didn't throw your pH way off. Other than that, I don't really see a huge downside to adding a little bit of ash to your gardens. It's kind of like anything else, though. You don't want to go overboard with it. Just a little bit will do you, and make sure that you didn't throw your pH off too much.
So burn away. Just get your soil tested from time to time. I like it. Matt, last question of the day. What's a good place? We've talked a lot about amending soils today for to grow these foodscaping plants, and we want to get this compost. We want to get compost, good soil. Where's a good place to source compost and topsoil, things like that, that we may add to improve our soil?
So the first one that comes to mind for me is we're lucky enough to live in an area that grows a lot of cotton. So you can go to a lot of the cotton gins and talk to them about getting some cotton gin trash, which, you know, it's not going to come composted, so you're going to need a place to put it and make a pile, but it'll compost down and make some good and good addition to your soil. We have some local zoos. Sometimes they're getting rid of stuff. Be mindful of what kind of manure they're getting rid of. You know, every animal is going to produce a different mix of nitrogen and things. You know, chickens are pretty high in ammonia with their waste, so just be mindful of that. And then we have a lot of peanut processing facilities, so I would check with them too. You know, it's going to be another product that you're going to have to compost down. But some of those peanut hulls, or if you talk to peanut farmers and get some of their peanut vines, if they're not using them for cattle feed or just putting them back into the soil, would be some good things. I did see that somebody asked about a source for Everglades tomato. I found it on Southern Exposure Seed Exchange, and they have two different. So a lot of times when you read articles about Everglades tomatoes, they're a different species. So there's Solanum pimpinifolium instead of Solanum lycopersicum,
Look at you,
which is our common tomato.
Yeah.
So on that Southern Exposure site, they have Everglades tomato listed, and they've got it listed the same species as our, you know, every other slicing tomato, but they also have a red currant tomato, which is that Solanum pimpinifolium, which is the other one that we usually think of when we think of Everglades tomato.
Interesting. That's pretty cool. All right. That's going to bring us to the end of our foodscaping webinar. I want to thank our panelists. Thank you, Josh, Lauren, Matt. It was a really fun kickoff to the year for me here, Gardening in the Panhandle Live. Again, thank you to Julie and Beth backstage for us. If you want to, if you didn't get a chance to take a note or something like that, we can absolutely, we'll post this on our Gardening in the Panhandle newsletter, a recap, so you can check that out there. And I do encourage y'all to go ahead and register. On April the 10th, our April edition of Gardening in the Panhandle Live is going to be on freeze-friendly foliage. So you'll get alliteration there and some plants that you can grow that will be unbothered by the frost and 6, 8, 10 inches of snow, depending on where you are in the Panhandle. Hopefully we don't have to deal with that again, but we'll definitely talk about some freeze-friendly foliage. We hope to see all of you online in April. Thanks, everybody, for joining us, and we will see y'all next month. Bye, everybody.
Bye.